Today is Transfiguration Sunday, we call it, when Jesus, as we just heard, goes up the mountain and is transfigured on the mountaintop. And this is always the gospel on the last Sunday of Epiphany. It marks the last Sunday of Epiphany because Epiphany is the season of light, and this is the ultimate act of light in the Gospels. And it also marks the fact that we will be beginning Lent this Wednesday, Ash Wednesday, and I hope you will be with us then. Today's gospel, when Jesus is transfigured and filled with light, a voice comes from the cloud that's overshadowing them and says, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." And those are the same words we're going to hear next week for First Lent, which is always the reading for First Lent, the story of Jesus being driven out into the wilderness. And it begins with his baptism immediately before he's driven into the wilderness. And at that baptism, you well know the words that come from the clouds at that moment too, which are the same. "You are my son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased." And so Mark has the beloved right at the start of Jesus' ministry, right at the baptism, and he has it right near the end of the ministry here at the Transfiguration. And so we could say that Mark has beloved bookends in his gospel, which seems appropriate since this is Valentine's Day and it's all about love. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that today, about love. Because when we are loved, when we're really loved, when it's unconditional love, that would be the love, some of you may be familiar with that feeling as a parent. You know, pretty much no matter what your child does, you still love them. You may not like them in that moment, but you still love them. There's a difference. Or you may know that feeling with grandchildren or with a partner or with a friend. Or maybe if you were one of the lucky ones, you knew that feeling from your own parents, that they had unconditional love for you the way God has unconditional love for all of us always. And when it's unconditional love like that, love no matter what, love even when it's undeserved, it makes us feel safe and cherished, or this word that's used in the gospel today, beloved. It's unconditional love because it keeps loving us even when we're disappointing or cruel or even evil. Being loved like that, despite all the hurt and havoc we may have caused, makes us feel unworthy. And it also makes us feel grateful that someone can keep loving us despite all of it. And when we have that feeling of gratitude for this undeserved love, it makes us feel like we just can't do enough to be worthy of that love. It's very motivating. It's very, as before I was saying with a teenager, you know, if you can just keep loving them, eventually they want to be worthy of your love. And it will motivate their behavior, as it does with all of us. That's what St. John meant when he said, "We love because he first loved us." So that love, that unconditional love from Jesus, even on that cross, that unconditional love for us, makes us feel like loving. It's just the way it works. Our love is a response to the love and undeserved forgiveness from that cross. We feel unworthy of that love. I'm sure you do too. It kind of shames us and forces us to look inside ourselves. That is the power of the cross and why it is so compelling. That is the power of undeserved love. It makes us want to be worthy of such love. It is life-changing. It is transformative. It is something that I know when I really grasp it, sometimes listening to a hymn, sometimes hearing a piece of scripture, I feel tears in my eyes because I'm just so overwhelmed by that kind of love that is there for us, whether or not we deserve it. It transfigures us, so to speak. Jesus himself talks about the power of that kind of love when others are expecting a negative response and they get kindness and caring. It changes things. In the story, Jesus tells if anyone wants to sue you, which is certainly a hostile act, if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your coat as well. Give your cloak as well, excuse me. So, not just your coat, but also your cloak. Give them both to them. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. That is such a loving, generous response to the kind of hostility Jesus is talking about in that story. It makes the accuser pause because they're not expecting that response. They're expecting you to return hatred, to return resentment, resistance, whatever. They're not expecting you to return kindness and generosity. And so it makes the accuser stop a moment and look inside themselves at their own behavior. And it brings that kind of healthy shame on the accuser. Just as the unjust torment of Jesus on the cross and his words of forgiveness, even in that horrible moment, brings shame on us all. If Jesus had said from the cross, "How can you do this to me? You people are miserable, hateful animals here on earth." And there would be a lot of truth in that. But it would not have had the same life-changing, world-changing effect that Jesus' words of forgiveness did have. It would instead probably discourage us and shut us down and cause us to dismiss or disregard him, and eventually even direct our own anger to him in response to those angry words. And we all know that from our own experience in relationships. You know, whenever there are harsh words spoken, do you think the other person is thinking about how all the nice things they wish they could be doing for you or even doing better for you? No, because those harsh words just elicit that hostile response where they're only thinking about you and what a jerk you are in that moment. They're not thinking about what they maybe need to think about or they maybe need to change. Harsh words don't change people. But the unexpected loving words that might come from you in that moment, that love and forgiveness, or maybe a few moments later, or even a day later, those are the kind of words we hear from the cross, and it changes us. Anyone who hears those words of Jesus is changed. It allows us the space to step back and reflect on our own behavior. We don't have that knee-jerk response of recrimination or what we're going to say to them since they said something so nasty to us. Instead, their generous response makes us think about ourselves and reflect on our behavior. And we see ourselves in the stark light of unconditional love. Jesus' words gave us pause also and made it hard for us to hate him. And it forced us to look inside ourselves and deal with our own sin and hatefulness. The unexpected love and forgiveness that we hear from the cross encourages us. It allows us to break our old destructive patterns and want to break them. It allows us the space to start fresh, knowing We too are beloved no matter what. The psalmist says it this way in Psalm 131, one of my very favorite psalms. Such knowledge is too wonderful. It is beyond my ability to comprehend. That is speaking to the unconditional love of God. Knowing such love changes people. It transforms people. It's a transfiguration of sorts, not maybe as spectacular as the transfiguration of Jesus today, but if you have witnessed it in your own life, you know it's pretty spectacular nonetheless. Love makes room for that kind of transformation. That's how love can be redemptive. That's how love is transformative, because it creates that space of grace where transformation can happen. Now, here we are this Sunday, kind of at the interesting intersection of the Transfiguration and Black History Month, and also Valentine's Day. Kind of a strange intersection, but nonetheless, it does seem appropriate then to turn to Dr. Martin Luther King on the subject of love. Now, this was one of Dr. King's most famous sermons, Love Our Enemy, it was titled. And he wrote it from jail, one of the many times he was jailed, and over a 2-week period. And he talks about how he honed this sermon over the years until he got it right where he wanted it to be, and had learned enough to make it just what he wanted. And so he talks in this sermon about the fact that we must love our enemies. And that's a lot coming from someone who had to deal with so much hatred, and in fact was even sitting in a jail cell as he wrote it. Love our enemies. And so he says we must do this because Jesus teaches it. And here is one of my favorite passages in that sermon. Hate is just as injurious to the person who hates. Hate scars the soul and distorts the personality of the hater. Like an unchecked cancer, hate corrodes the personality and eats away its vital unity. So Jesus says, love, because hate destroys the hater as well as the hated. We have to love. Now, he also goes on to say, but we don't have to like. There's a difference. I was talking about that at the beginning with teenagers. I think that's one of the ways we can kind of understand this concept. We don't have to like the person, meaning there doesn't have to be agreement with what they're doing or their beliefs or their politics. We resist those things, and yet we love the person. It's not the kind of love we are talking about today on Valentine's Day, which is that very sentimental, very intimate, very affectionate kind of love. That's not what Dr. King is talking about, nor was it what Jesus was talking about. They were both talking about what was later translated as agape love. That is a different, bigger kind of love. It's not the sentimental, affectionate kind of love we might think about. It's that when you wish the best for someone. You may have known that love in a situation, say, where you were able to forgive someone, but you weren't able to forget what they had done, and you were not able to even have a lot of relationship with them afterwards, but you wish the best for them on their way. You wish the best for them. That's agape love, is when we actually desire the well-being of people. We desire their well-being. We desire the well-being of all people as Christians. And that is something that is not easy to do all the time, but we are asked, we are commanded to do it, actually, by Jesus. And we have no excuse to not be able to do it if someone like Dr. Martin Luther King could do it. Certainly we can try our best. One of the best stories I've read that exemplifies how hate destroys the hater as well as the hated, as Dr. King says, comes from Louise Dickinson Rich. And I'm going to read that story to you. It's a wonderful story. My grandmother had an enemy named Mrs. Wilcox. Grandma and Mrs. Wilcox moved as brides into next-door houses on the main street of the tiny town in which they were to live their entire lives. I don't know what started the war between them, and I don't think that by the time I came along over 30 years later, they remembered themselves what started it. This was no polite sparring match. This was total war. Nothing in town escaped repercussion. The 300-year-old church, which had lived through the Revolution, the Civil War, and the Spanish War, almost went down when Grandma and Mrs. Wilcox fought the Battle of the Ladies' Guild. Grandma won that engagement, but it was a hollow victory. Mrs. Wilcox, since she couldn't be president, resigned in a huff. Mrs. Wilcox won the Battle of the Public Library, getting her niece Gertrude appointed librarian instead of our Aunt Phyllis. The day Gertrude took over was the day Grandma stopped reading library books. When, as children, we visited my grandmother, part of the fun was making faces at Mrs. Wilcox's grandchildren. One banner day, we put a snake into the Wilcox's rain barrel. My grandmother made token protests, but we sensed her tacit approval. Don't think for a minute that this was a one-sided campaign. Mrs. Wilcox had grandchildren too, and never a windy wash day went by that the clothesline didn't mysteriously break, with the clothes falling into the dirt. I don't know how Grandma could have borne her troubles so long if it hadn't been for the household page of her daily Boston newspaper. This household page was a wonderful institution. Besides the usual cooking hints and cleaning advice, it had a department composed of letters from readers to each other. The idea was that if you had a problem or even needed just to let off some steam, you wrote a letter to the paper, signing some fancy anonymous name like Arbutus. That was Grandma's pen name. Then some of the other ladies who had the same problem wrote back and told you what they had done about it, signing themselves One Who Knows or Xanthippe or whatever. Very often the problem disposed of, you kept on for years writing to each other through the column of the paper, telling each other about your children and your canning and your new dining room suite. That's what happened to Grandma. She and a woman called Seagull corresponded for a quarter of a century. Seagull was Grandma's true friend. When I was about 16, Mrs. Wilcox died. In a small town, no matter how much you have hated your next-door neighbor, it is only common decency to run over and see what practical service you can give to the bereaved. Grandma, neat in a percale apron to show that she meant what she said about being put to work, crossed the lawn to the Wilcox house, where the Wilcox daughters set her to cleaning the already immaculate front parlor for the funeral. And there, on the parlor table in the place of honor, was a huge scrapbook. And in the scrapbook, pasted neatly in parallel columns, were Grandma's letters to Seagull, and Seagull's letters to Grandma over the years. Though neither woman had known it, Grandma's worst enemy had been her best friend. That was the only time I remember seeing my grandmother cry. I didn't know then exactly what she was crying about, but I do know now. She was crying for all the wasted years which could never be salvaged. Just as Dr. King observed in his sermon, hate indeed became a cancer that gnawed at their relationship and spread throughout their little community, infected the grandchildren of Arbutus and Seagull's grandchildren as well. No one was spared. As Dr. King says at the end of his sermon, Loving Your Enemies, When you start hating anybody, it destroys the very center of your creative response to life and the universe. So love everybody. Hate is like eroding acid that eats away the best and the objective center of your life. Jesus says love because hate destroys the hater as well as the hated. And so Jesus says, love your enemy. Amen.